Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Welcome to this week's show. Normally in January, you would find me in Las Vegas at the Consumer Electronics Show. With COVID happening, we did not make it to Las Vegas this year. Normally at CES, I do a bunch of interviews in the mobile studio, and I have a set of regular guests that I have join me at CES every year to kind of give me their update on leading technologies, trends, things that you want to keep an eye on, particularly as innovators. How does that apply to maybe a problem you're trying to solve or a project that you are working on? So rather than just writing it off and saying, we'll wait till next year's CES, I am bringing on one of those guests today onto this show. Today's guest is Bob O'Donnell. Bob is the president and chief analyst for TECHnalysis Research. Now, TECHnalysis is one of the leading technology analyst firms in Silicon Valley. Bob and I have known each other for decades. Earlier in his career, he was at IDC when I was the CTO for Hewlett-Packard. Bob led the team that IDC had that would be predicting sales of things like PCs and printers, which was very key in the consumer electronics industry, which was very important to HP. Now, a little secret, Bob and I actually go back much, much further. It turns out that Bob and I grew up within 2 to 3 blocks of each other on the south side of Chicago. So we actually grew up together. We actually went to grade school and high school together, lost track of each other for 20 years, reconnected in Silicon Valley. So Bob and I are close friends, so I just want to make that clear. You'll hear a reference at the end of today's interview talking about what he refers to as the Glenwood Mafia. But Bob's influence in the technology world is significant. He gets quoted quite regularly on Bloomberg TV and CNBC and Investors Business Daily and the Wall Street Journal. He writes a regular column for USA Today in the tech section. He also writes occasionally for Fast Company, Engadget, you name it. If somebody wants to know about deep technology, particularly in areas of 5G and semiconductor and things like that, Bob is the go-to guy, in addition to his deep expertise on electronic devices like mobile phones, laptops, printers, those types of things. So today in the interview, Bob and I cover a wide range of areas. We talk about the pace of innovation, COVID and COVID's impact on supply chain. We talk about PCs, broadband. At the end, I asked Bob to list what is the one technology that he would want you to pay attention to? The one technology that could have the biggest impact on you as an individual, but also on your organizations. And at the end, that's what we cover. So you're going to want to listen to this show to the end to hear Bob's advice on that one technology. Now, before we hop into today's show, I've got the favor to ask. So follow, like, and share. Follow us on social media, like this show, and share it. If there's other people who you think would benefit from hearing Bob and mine's conversation today around trends and technologies and broadband, etc., then forward that show onto it. You can find the direct link to the audio file at the bottom of the show notes for today's show over at killerinnovations.com. And with that, let's hop into this week's episode. So, Bob, great to see you again, man. This COVID's kept us apart for a lot longer than we've ever been apart from the standpoint of being able to talk over the years.
It sure has, Phil, and and it is great to be back again and chatting with you. Um, look, and obviously it's going to be very interesting to look back, 10 years from now, how we look back at what COVID did, obviously, to society. But the obvious deal from a tech perspective, the impact of COVID has been so immediate and so huge when we think about what it's done to how people, use devices, the types of devices they're using, the expectations that they have. I mean, we've for years, there's been this talk of, digital transformation and all these big trends that we knew were coming, and but clearly COVID has accelerated so many of them and at so many different levels, and it's hard to even now see how much of it is because we're still so close to it. But there's a couple really obvious things that I think that we're all dealing with. The fact that we're doing this, via a Zoom call is number one, right? I mean, the world has dramatically changed how we communicate, whether it's for business purposes, for work purposes, and that in turn has derived or has driven, I should say, a number of big changes. First, you know, the importance and the quality of broadband connections never ever been more important, right? Nobody ever questions anymore how critical it is to have fast, good broadband, consistent broadband, and oh, by the way, maybe even backup broadband. Things that as a consumer you would never even think about. Now you're like, actually, I'd really like a broadband connection with a cellular backup, which of course that's actually how businesses operate these days. And so it's like now you even see consumers thinking, wouldn't that be interesting? I literally just wrote an article for USA Today last week talking about a lot of the big changes in broadband and talked about, hey, this is what I really want. And I've talked to some of the big carriers and some of the other service providers about that, and they're thinking about it. They're thinking about those kinds of things because of this dependence we all now have on broadband, whether it's for a Zoom call or a Teams call, or, just in general, we really need that connectivity. And of course, at the same time, we've seen the growth of 5G, slow growth of 5G, to be fair, not really done what a lot of people expected, but even there, right? The beginning of 22, we saw the launch of C-band, particularly for AT&T and Verizon, and that has had a huge impact because now finally, T-Mo, to their credit, has already been doing this for a while, but finally we're getting kind of the beginnings of what the real 5G experience is supposed to be like. So there's a lot to dive into there, but in general, it's just really interesting to see how much more connected we all are, how much more dependent we are on the devices that we have. I mean, we've seen PC shipments after 10 years of decline, went up a ton in 21 or in 20, and then again in 22 we hit almost record levels of PCs. Back when you and I used to be talking about PCs all the time, right? 2011, that's when you were at HP then, and I was at IDC then. Um, and obviously that whole PC renaissance has been amazing to see how important large screen devices have become. Look, big monitors are the thing now, right? It's like it's not just about having great PCs; it's about having huge displays. Like I have a, I normally work from when I'm working at home. I've got this 40, what is it, 43-inch wide Dell monitor that I use. That's just spectacular. I was just at a hotel up in LA yesterday. I was doing an event with Verizon, and I saw a guy in the hotel that has the Asus ZenBook that's got the two fold out screens.
Yeah, the
And
wings, the wings that
yeah,
hang off the
the
side.
wings.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the first time I'd seen one live because, of course, we haven't been at trade shows to be able to see that. We've seen pictures of these things. And he swears by it. He says, "Oh yeah, man, it's changed my life. I can, anywhere I go, I've got this, all-in-one system." So anyway, it's so much happening on terms of how the connectivity, how COVID has driven the need for connectivity, which in turn has driven the need for more connected devices per person, which in turn has also driven the need for more types of devices, bigger screens for PCs. We saw a slowdown in smartphones initially. Now we're starting to see some of that come back as we see 5G. All kinds of interesting things going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you talk about the broadband during COVID, right? So, my day job at Cable Labs. Right in the early days of COVID, we were watching. We have access to all of the broadband providers that are part of that fund the research at Cable Labs. We can see their usage around the world, and we actually have members of Cable Labs that are in China, so we could watch what was happening in broadband usage in China before it ever came to the U.S. or even went to Europe, and that growth. Now the benefit is the broadband industry overbuilds. They build excess capacity because it takes so long to get ahead of it, right? So you
Sure,
always
of
want to.
course.
And so typically the broadband industry globally builds 2.5 years of capacity ahead of time. Well, guess what? COVID ate up about 2 years of capacity within the first 14 days after starting March 1st.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just because now you had everybody home. People were
Yeah.
working from home. So you had spouses, kids, aunts and uncles, grandparents, everybody's now stuck in their house, and everybody's on all day long, whether it's streaming Netflix during the day. And if you looked historically, the peak demand was always in the evening, and it actually always shifted to the weekend because that's when the
Right.
biggest streaming traffic happens in broadband is on the weekends. And usually it's on Sunday, right? And so we actually jokingly said in cable industry is every day became Sunday.
Right.
Because now people are streaming during the week, particularly early on when Learn from Home wasn't ready. So basically, what are you going to do? You got to keep the kids entertained because you're trying to
Right.
figure out how do you do your job when you
Yep.
can't get into an office or you can't drive because they won't let you. In the early days, wouldn't even allow you to get in your car and be on the road. In fact, it was funny. I had a letter from the federal government that gave me clearance to drive on a road because the cable industry, the cable networks are defined as critical services. So you had to
Right.
have this letter to carry in case the police stopped you to ask you why you're out of your house, But
Yeah.
broadband, and I think, the networks did phenomenal. Providers like Zoom, who is a sponsor of this show, so just to be perfectly clear, did a phenomenal job. And I was on the phone with Zoom and WebEx and the Microsoft team, and everybody came together to try to make sure that everything was being provided, but it gave a lot of insight. And I think it's going to have a residual effect. Are people going to go
Oh,
back into the office? I mean, like you said, I have an HP very large monitor, so
yeah.
my 40-inch HP monitor on my desk here, I've had it, it's probably got to be 7, 8 years old. I love it. I absolutely love it. And it's actually a bigger monitor than I have on my desk at the office. So I'm actually
Right.
have a better productivity setup now that I've been working from home. Now you've been a little bit different. You've been working from home for forever.
I have, but I used to travel a lot, right? And obviously, I haven't been traveling very much for the last 2 years. Road trips here and there, but not a whole lot of flights. And obviously, there haven't been a whole lot of events or trade shows or anything else to attend. And normally we would do this at CES. I didn't go to CES this year, and a lot of people didn't, obviously. Um, and so I have adjusted, and it did give me, for having years of working at home, being an independent analyst, it allowed me to kind of build the situation I need. But then I was always, ready. I had to be ready to go, and I'd go back and forth. But so many people now have moved to that, set up a really strong work from home environment. And it's interesting because it reflects what we're seeing in the PC market. Initially, remember when it first started almost 2 years ago now, the COVID thing, people were scrambling to get like any notebook they could. They're like, just get me something because I have nothing. All I've had at work is a desktop. I can't physically go in and get it, blah, blah, blah. And so people kind of looked for everything they could. PC numbers were going way up. Now we're in this situation where the people who initially bought something to kind of get them through are like, you know what? I'm going to be doing this longer than I thought I would. So now I'm going to invest. And, the other interesting thing we've seen is the biggest sale, the low end PC market has frankly not done well at all. And was a huge initially a ton of Chromebooks for school and things like that. All of that has died off. Now it's all the high-end PCs, the
Yeah.
well-configured PCs, because people recognize, well, look, I need a good piece of a kit here to be able to do all this stuff. Things like the cameras matter, the quality of the microphones matter, all these things that we used to be kind of like, oh, those are nice to have, we don't really care, are absolutely essential. People buying much more sophisticated webcams, higher quality headsets. Again, large monitors have been, they can't make enough of them. So all this has impacted this. And again, the in all the platforms, between the Zoom, Zoom, excuse me, not so much Skype, although few people still use it, but Teams and Google Meet, Cisco WebEx, all these things. You've got this explosion of these different platforms. Of course, they've all been trying to jockey for position, but in the end, everybody knows, well, I'm going to be using all these things. I do a call on each one of them almost every day, it seems like. So, but that has huge implications for when people do go back to the office. Because remember that back in the office, what a lot of companies left were actually 5-year-old Skype systems sitting in occasional conference rooms. They're going to have to completely replace all of that infrastructure and rebuild this whole thing and enable systems that let me use any one of those platforms. Because even if I'm a in-house Zoom shop or in-house WebEx shop, the rest of the world has made other choices, so I have to be prepared to do that. So I think we're going to see an explosion in installs. And back to your HP days, the Halo systems, right? Those amazing systems that you had early on now have become sort of de rigueur, but they've got to be able to work and interoperate with these other stuff. And that has a huge impact on people who made big investments in some of these rooms, and how do they evolve those?
Well, it's interesting because it's almost, early on in COVID, everybody kind of dug their heels in, right? You got to make the room a Zoom meeting because that's what I have, and now it's become kind of this etiquette that says whoever the host is gets to define the platform.
Right.
And then you adapt to them. So you fire up your teams, they send you a meeting invite for WebEx. So you kind of have to learn all of these different platforms versus it used to be, we only allow WebEx, or we have to use Teams. We don't allow our employees to log into anything other than Teams. And now it's kind of like everybody's kind of said, okay, whoever's initiating the meeting, whoever's hosting the meeting, they get to define the platform that you have to be used. But it was interesting your point about, stepping up. You looked at, and you still track it, and I still track it. In fact, I call the guys over at HP and remind them I held on to all my retirement shares, so they better do a good job. On keeping the HP share price, going. But it's the higher end. It's the mobile. In the case of the HP parlance, it would be the mobile workstations groups. And like I've got an HP Create, which is an i9 and a laptop form factor, and it's a killer platform. I love it. And I was the first one to get one. HP gave me a loaner for a little bit, and then I had Cable Labs buy one for me. But now everybody at Cable Labs has seen what I've got, and they're all buying the same thing. Because the same, it's no longer where you could come in and you could offload your work or whatever. People are like, I've got to be 100% self-contained for anything that might get thrown at me.
Exactly.
But it's also interesting, a lot of people overestimate what they need in many cases, right? It's like broadband. What do people buy for broadband at their house? They think, well, I've got Zoom. I need lots of. Average Zoom call only takes 4 megabits into a residential home. So even if you had a spouse, and 2 kids, in the home, you only need 16 to 20 megabits to do your Zoom calls, right? It's the everything else. It's your Xbox update. It's your Netflix streaming. It's
Yeah, well,
everything.
I
It's
say a 4K
everything
stream is
else.
25 megs, right? And if you've got three people in a house all watching three different things, that's 75 megs right there,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And oh, by the way, look, we all know there's the theoretical of, oh yeah, I bought a 200 meg system. It's never giving you 200 megs consistently. I don't care what type of of delivery mechanism, whether it's cable or fixed wireless or fiber or whatever, right? These things go up and down, and so you do have to over provision
Right.
as it and oh, by the way, the other thing is, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I've noticed, my broadband has gone down a couple of times, and there's been a couple of times where I've had to switch to a cellular equipped
Yep.
PC to keep going.
Yep.
Luckily, it's never been for more than a day, but when your whole livelihood is dependent upon being able to be connected, there's like a couple of days in a year is a big deal.
Yep. Well,
And so,
you pointed it out, right? There's been this movement on the business customer side. So whatever broadband, whether you're doing fiber or you're doing an HFC, cable, DOCSIS delivery of broadband for businesses, most of those players have had the cellular backup, so it'll
yep,
automatically move you and shift you. So you don't have to change where your wireless
right,
printers are connecting, right? It all looks the same. You're just going out over cellular. And, now you're starting to see that bleed into the consumer side. More and more consumer,
yep,
offerings now are offering some form of cellular, or people have figured out, I can, tether to my mobile phone
right,
and get some, and some basics. And the nice thing is, the Teams, the WebExes, the Zooms of the world have done a really good job of kind of optimizing and auto
right.
detecting. Okay, what kind of capacity do I have? Okay,
What can I? Yeah,
keep
exactly.
audio, always keep audio good, degrade the video.
Yeah,
Be willing to
yep,
degrade, but keep that audio at really top notch, degrade that video. And they've gotten pretty smart. All the applications you've seen, what was it, last year? I had Brandon, who's the CTO at Zoom, on the show, and I did an interview with him for a cable industry event. Last year, Zoom released 320 features in 1 year.
yeah. I
It's
tell you,
like,
it's
how do you keep up with the pace? And this, I guess, gets back to kind of another topic I want to talk to you about is the pace of innovation is going at such a clip. I mean,
yeah,
I have to, because like, you've got your newsletter, the TECHnalysis newsletter on LinkedIn. I've got, John Fort. I follow his stuff, with his newsletter I got to read you guys because I sure, here I was CTO at HP. I have no shot of keeping up with every, and each of you guys have kind of carved out your little niche, right? I know
right,
you've been doing a lot with Verizon on 5G. I'm going to talk about
yeah.
that. But the pace of innovation, man, I don't know how
It's
how do you keep up anymore?
Well, it's hard, but it's fun. I mean, look, that's why I do the gig, right? Because this is the stuff I love, and but it is amazing, and particularly video conferencing. And what's amazing about that is, and obviously it's because of the competition, right? Because you have really at least four and arguably five different video conferencing platforms that people use on a regular basis, and they're all competing. So the pace of innovation in that area is crazy. And here's the other amazing thing. Remember, benchmarking PCs never used to include video conferencing. Like maybe they talk about it, but that was never issued. Now, literally, like there is no more important benchmark than how does this PC do on a Zoom call or a Teams call or what? It's crazy. Like the whole world is immediately shifted. It's like, hey man, that's what I care about. And
Well,
it's just
now
incredible to see that.
you're giving me a flashback. So when I was at HP and we'd ever release a new laptop, we always had to worry about the Walt Mossberg test, right? So the Walt
Right?
Mossberg test was he would turn the screen brightness up to full brightness, and then he would drop in a DVD
Right.
and
And just let
play
it
the
play.
DVD continuously at screen at full brightness. And that was the battery test. That was the Walt Mossberg Wall Street Journal test for battery life on a laptop, right? Today, I was laughing. My wife wanted to buy a new laptop, right? And she's like, well, I want one with a DVD player. I'm like, not happening. And
Not happening.
they don't even make one that has
Yeah.
that you can buy today with a Blu-ray player in it. They don't make them
Yeah.
anymore.
No, it's true. It's very true. But I mean, again, it's just indicative again that, like you said, of that pace of innovation and what's happening. And we see on the chip side, right? The chip space has never been more interesting and more competitive. I mean, you look at what AMD has been able to do. Um, look at the moves that Intel's making now that Gelsinger's back, and seeing what he's trying to do in terms of driving the foundry business as well as everything else. All the work they're doing with governments around the world to drive more semiconductor innovation, and this whole supply chain. Again, another COVID-driven thing is all the supply chain concerns we've seen. People can't buy cars because it turns out there's chips there. So now everybody in the world now at least kind of knows something about chips, which they never used to, really, right?
Right.
The vast majority of people are like, yeah, whatever. Now everybody knows, oh, this is kind of a big deal. And so you see all kinds of geopolitical implications from that. I mean, again, all driven by these big changes. And again, the connectivity changes. And and you mentioned 5G. I thought I'd just kind of dive
Yep.
into the 5G thing a little bit. But, you know, what's interesting for those who haven't really been keeping track, and I do write a lot about this for Forbes. You can find my stuff on Forbes and USA Today, and as well as LinkedIn. The US has actually been behind a good portion of the world on 5G. And the reason why it has to do with radio spectrum. And whenever I talk about radio spectrum, you can see everybody's eyes roll over like, oh my God, please don't talk about radio spectrum. It's because everybody thinks it's this super crazy, confusing thing. It's really just basic science. It's not that hard. Think of it like, a radio dial, right? You have different frequencies and different signals, different channels are different stations, right? If you're tuning into 88.5 versus 107.7, or if you're switching from AM to FM, you're at different bands. At the end of the day, that's all RF, right? So is Wi-Fi is RF, right? 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz. These are all RF things. So in the cellular world, when we moved to 5G, most of the world started using a different set of frequencies. That's called midband. Typically 2.5 to 4. It's real. Technically goes all the way up to 6 gigahertz. Anyway, the reason this matters is because by using those new frequencies, there were wider paths to send more data. In the US, on the other hand, we started out with low band, that's below 1 gigahertz. And that's, by the way, been used for 4G for decades. And that's why a lot of the initial 5G stuff was no faster than 4G, because it was using the same frequencies and by the same small 5 megahertz channels, or millimeter wave, which was super fast, but because it had 100 megahertz channels and a ton of empty space, but doesn't travel far. So I like to use the analogy, it's like musical, think of it musically. So if you've ever been, driven past a concert venue, when you're 2 miles away, you can hear the bass, the low frequencies, because they travel the farthest. As you get closer, as you're passing a stadium or, passing a concert, whatever, all of a sudden you start to hear more higher frequencies. And then when you're right next to it, you can hear the crash of the cymbals and the super high frequencies. That's exactly how to think about, the frequencies being used for cellular, because millimeter wave stuff, super fast, in this case, super high from an audio perspective, but doesn't travel far. Bass frequencies, the low frequencies, travel a long, long way. So in the US, you had 3 different bands. You had low band, mid band, high band. We started out low band, high band. The rest of the world started out all mid band. And then there was a recognition that, hey, actually, mid band's probably the right place to be. And this is why T-Mobile bought Sprint many years ago, because Sprint smartly had acquired rights to a whole bunch of mid-band frequencies. Some of this originally was going to be used for what was that called?
It was WiMAX.
WiMAX, yes.
It was they actually acquired it when Sprint bought Nextel.
Right, exactly. Yep. And they were going to use it for WiMAX, which was a ill-fated other wireless technology. But The good news was it was spectrum, was access to this critical spectrum. So T-Mo has been able to build up and use this 2.5 gigahertz spectrum and big chunks of it to build out their network, which is why they right now have had the fastest 5G network in the US for quite some time. AT&T and T-Mobile, or excuse me, AT&T and Verizon, on the other hand, didn't have much of any of that. So that's why they spent literally $80 billion acquiring access to what's called C-band. It's been in the news quite a bit lately. And C-band is roughly 3.7 to almost 4 gigahertz. And great, used to be used for satellites. So, those big satellite dish, remember they were called C-band satellites.
Yeah, 3-meter. It was all based on the 3-meter dishes for primarily for downlink. It was a great distribution network.
Exactly. So those have been used for there, and they recognized that industry had gone away. So the FCC said, "Hey, we'll pay you guys a bunch of money to take those frequencies back, and then we're going to sell them." And they made a ton on it. And that's what they've started to deploy, and that's allowed the first mid-band 5G to come to life. And that's now we're starting to see these hundreds of megabits per second, faster than Wi-Fi in a lot of cases, cellular connections. Mm-hmm. The big news recently, of course, was this whole FAA thing, and it's crazy. So again, if we think about these frequency spectrum, radio altimeters are these things, and now everybody in the world knows about a radio altimeter because of all this. They're a device in a plane that's used to determine if, as a plane is landing, if it's close to the ground, sort of like a radar type thing. Sends a beacon out, says, "Hey, how close am I to the ground?" Blah blah blah. They operate and have operated for 30 plus years, 40 years, in a frequency of 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. That is far away from a radio frequency perspective from where C-band is. But everybody got up in arms because the FCC didn't talk to the FAA, and they said, "Oh, this could be bad." Anybody who knows anything about any of this, and I'm not an engineer, I was a great books major, for God's sake, but it's basic science. You filter signals out. It would be like buying a radio where if you tune to 107.7, you actually were still picking up the signals from 88.5. That doesn't happen. Nobody designs that. That's horrific design. But there was some concern that some altimeters, wouldn't be able to, basically filter out the frequencies. That's why there's been this huge hullabaloo. It's completely non-scientific. And of course, we've gone from it being planes falling out of the sky to 90% of planes are now approved. And I guarantee you, within a few weeks, it's going to be 100% of planes are going to be approved to function without problem. But in the meantime, they've lowered the amount of power they're using around airports for all of this. Anyway, it's a long, complicated story. I did do an explainer on USA Today, and I think I did some on Forbes as well.
Well, my analogy on it is our modern version of Y2K.
Yes, yeah, you're right. That's pretty much what it is. And except, actually, that's a good analogy because everybody knew it was coming. You could have planned for it, and yet a lot of people didn't.
Yeah, they didn't plan for it, and a lot of the concern is old planes that never upgraded their avionics.
Exactly.
They've got 20, 30-year-old avionics, and it's like, oh my gosh, this wasn't considered. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, which I find crazy because, of course, it's not like those frequencies were sitting there unused. They've been used for satellites. Just that those satellites
and what's interesting because at Cable Labs we did the analysis on C-band because the cable industry is a big user of C-band for the downlinks. That's how video gets distributed. That then feeds into your cable system for a lot of places, right? But a lot of the cable operators over the years shifted. They put that in one place. So for some of the cable operators, it happens to be here in Denver. So they take the feeds off the satellite, then they drop it onto the fiber optics, and they distribute it to the rest of the country. Versus you would see these dishes all over the place. You don't see those as much anymore. They are, however, very important in Alaska. That's how video gets distributed to the to the north shore, way up to the north in oil country in Alaska is by these C-band dishes. But it's like they didn't know it was coming. And again, it's about innovation pace, right?
Yes.
And the fact is, you still had avionics in planes that are 30 years old.
Oh, yeah.
So you have one rate of innovation, and then you've got this other rate of innovation happening so much faster that then you get these, touch points or, theoretical collisions, right? Where
Right.
things aren't compatible or they don't work or whatever. And then when you get to the other side, it's kind of like, okay, it was no big deal.
Right.
It
No, well,
it all worked
exactly.
out.
And the sad thing is it's soured a lot of people to 5G. It's given this negative flavor to 5G, which is a really innovative and cool thing. And at the worst possible time, just as most of the country was finally going to get their first taste of 5G. Again, unless you're a T-Mo customer, and kudos to T-Mo because they've been ahead of this game for a while now. But there's a lot of AT&T and Verizon customers out there, right? And they were just starting to get their first taste of it. Then hear all this stuff, and then it just creates this scaremongering, fear mongering, anti-science. Gosh, where have we seen that before? Bias that keeps innovation from being held back, and that's frustrating. To see that because there's so many interesting things that are just on the cusp of happening.
Well, it's interesting because I was just recently having a conversation with some of the leaders at Vodafone Germany, which is the biggest of the Vodafone properties. They happen to be members of Cable Labs. Hannes, who's the CEO for Vodafone Germany, sits on my board. And they've been, if you've been following the press with Vodafone Germany, they've been probably the world leaders, proponents on 5G private networks. So they I don't know, it's probably a couple of months ago, they unveiled a fully 5G, full speed, mid-band 5G private network with network slicing at the main factory for Porsche. So
Right.
now everything in the Porsche factory is now running over the 5G network. So they don't have to worry about, sensors on the factory line or the test track. They wired it used to be they would take cars around the track and then you'd pull it off to the side and then download the data, do the analysis, tune the car a little differently, and then put it back on track. Because there was no wireless network fast enough to offload the data as it was speeding around the track. With the 5G private network at the Porsche test track now, they're now doing real-time monitoring, and they can do real-time tuning and push updates to the car while it's on the track. So now they have a whole different level of sophistication because they don't have to have a connection. They don't have to pull something out of a car or stick a USB into some slot in the car to do the updates. It's literally, it takes out any form of artificial latency that's inherent in a lot of networks.
Exactly, and that's a great example because, in fact, I'm literally, as we speak, launching a private 5G network study. Part of what I do is for TECHnalysis research is my own research, and I'm literally embarking on that study to dive more into the details of how companies are doing it. But that's an excellent example, Phil, because some people said, "Well, I could just use Wi-Fi." Well, you can't use Wi-Fi over a test track, right? That doesn't really work. There are certain cases where you have to have a cellular connection, and wide area and outside in particular, that's really where you're going to need a cellular network. And so that's an excellent example of private 5G. And you're right, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. Boy, you talk about a hot topic. The reason I'm doing research on it now is like every vendor I work with, from the chip guys to the software guys to the device guys to the network guys, everybody's talking about private 5G and the potential impact it has. So another interesting innovation story where they're taking a technology and applying it away, and they're doing these real-time IoT types of things. Like we've been talking about IoT forever, and yet it's had a hard time. You match IoT with 5G, and all of a sudden you start to do some really interesting things that you couldn't really do before.
Yeah, and there's actually been a bunch of these attempts at trying to create kind of a quote IoT network. And what everybody's figured out is the construction cost of these overlapping wireless networks, even if you put them in different spectrum bands, is just too expensive. It's not the spectrum, you talk about how expensive spectrum is.
Yeah.
That's a rounding error when you got to think about towers.
Yes.
Fiber to the tower, all the
network
poor
core,
network
all the
costs, right? And so if you can just say, look, I just want a network slice. I want to I've got a 5G network. Give me a private portion of that network, slicing it was what they referred
Yep.
to it as. Slice me off. All I need is 25 megabits. I don't need even a lot of
Yeah.
speed, but I need it to where I can burst data off of sensors. And
Yep.
then, Qualcomm and the other chip guys are making really great low power, low footprint, chipsets for these IoT devices. Now you can put it in there. And talk about pace of innovation. We've seen hundreds of millions of IoT devices. We're going to be in the billions and trillions
Yeah.
of these
Yeah.
IoT sensors into everything you could even imagine, right? Talk about the surveillance economy. You're not going to be able to go anywhere without some IoT sensor watching what you're doing.
Well, which raises a whole nother set of questions. But yes, I mean, and look, and for businesses that are tracking things like manufacturing or something like a Porsche, then there's a lot of things going on. But we are going to see a whole lot of that. And again, I think you're going to see some serious privacy and security concerns that pop up from some of these sensors. But um, that'll be again sort of a different topic, and seeing how people handle that is going to be interesting. But we are finally, I mean, to me it's important because look, we've been talking about IoT for 10 plus years, and it's one of those technologies that people all said, oh, this is going to be awesome because we're going to be able to do predictive maintenance and all these cool things and everything else. And yeah, you got a couple of companies doing it, but a lot of them are finding that the costs to deploy it are so high that when they do a proof of concept, they're like, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not there. But luckily, costs are going down. Like you said, they're figuring out clever ways to slice a network or do other things that allow them to build off existing infrastructure and then take advantage of that.
Yep. Yep. So as we kind of coming to the end here, we're wrapping it up. I've got a question for you that I'm sure my listeners are all keenly interested. What is the one, I don't know what you're going to call it, trend or thing that's coming that you are most excited about? I mean, we've talked about probably a bunch of them here, but if you had to pick one that you think is going to have the biggest impact on people's lives, businesses, what would that be? What would be the one thing that you would tell people, this is the thing you want to keep your eyes on?
Oh man, that's a great question. There are so many different things. I mean, look, from a practical, tangible perspective, I've been, and it's been a little slow in coming. I'm a huge believer in foldable phones. Like, I think we're going to see a lot more foldable phones, and that's going to change how people view the device that we all carry now with them. I think we're going to see Apple eventually get into that, which of course will legitimize the market, even though Samsung's been doing it for years now. But I think that'll be interesting. At a high level, the chip manufacturing is going to have a huge economic impact in a lot of different places. And 5G, for all the hype and the fact that it hasn't really delivered on what people expected, eventually I think does open up a lot of interesting opportunities when we can start to do network slicing and what have you. And all of this is driven obviously more um, move to the cloud, and everybody has. It's easy to presume that the move to cloud computing is essentially over. We're still again in like the second inning of that transition. So I mean, all of those big picture things, move to the cloud, edge computing. I think when you combine the cloud with a 5G network, some of those IoT applications we talked about, I think when we start to add intelligence into the network and there's more compute capability closer to the edge of the network, and by the way, that's still very poorly defined by most organizations, what the edge actually is. But point is, by adding compute into the network, leveraging AI models on that, you start to be able to think about, building new kinds of experiences and services that I think people are going to really enjoy. And it's going to change their lives. But
Yep.
we're still a few years off.
Yep. Hey, Bob, thanks for taking the time. Normally we would catch up at CES. I was going to be at CES, but that blew up, with everything else with COVID. But it was good to be able to catch up with you. And we're going to have to do this more frequently. We're going to bring you back on the show, not
Hey.
once a year, but maybe a couple times a year to kind of share.
Happy to do it. Always happy to keep the Glenwood Mafia moving forward.
And for those of you who listening, you don't know what the Glenwood Mafia is, you'll have to go back and listen to the last time Bob was on the show. We kind of went into the detail. Bob and I grew up in the same town as kids, actually, south side of Chicago. So you'll have
Indeed.
to, and I'm sure the Gus and the rest of the guys in the group from the area will be listening, and I'm sure we'll comment. So, Bob, again, thanks a lot for joining us here today on the show.
Thanks, Phil. Always good to chat.
So, what technology did Bob list here at the end of the episode is the one that you are most interested in? Was it the foldable phones, semiconductor, the chip industry, 5G, the continued expansion of cloud computing, edge computing, where it's about adding intelligence to the network? Which of those? Now, the funny part is I asked Bob to list one, right? And he listed 5. So you have a choice of 5. What is the one that you are most interested in, the one that you need to keep an eye on? Now, for me, the semiconductor industry, because that's a fundamental innovation that's going to have a broad impact on everything from automobiles to computing platforms, your mobile phone, your dishwasher, your you name it. Semiconductors play a fundamental technology, and there is so much change happening there. So much investments. Intel announcing $30 billion into new manufacturing facilities for the next generation of chips, new kinds of AI chips. This is an amazing time. So for me, the technology that I follow closely would be the semiconductor, the chip industry. Now, I mentioned briefly in the show about Bob's newsletter. You can sign up for Bob's newsletter, TECHnalysis Research. It's a free newsletter over on LinkedIn, in the newsletter area of LinkedIn. I'll track down a link to it and I'll put it in the bottom of the show notes, or you can just search for Bob O'Donnell, TECHnalysis, TECHANALYSIS. So it's technology and analysis, smashing those two words together. So Bob O'Donnell, TECHnalysis Research, free newsletter. It's available on LinkedIn. Subscribe to that. Follow. You can keep up with everything that Bob is doing and his predictions of technologies and the latest things that are happening. You can also read his articles on USA Today and Bloomberg TV and CNBC, and you can find him in a variety of different publications. But you want to follow Bob. You want to keep up with his thinking on what's the latest and greatest and what are the things that are going to have an impact on your life. With that, let's wrap up today's show. We're gone a little longer than normal. Thank you for hanging in there. Your time is valuable. Hope you found this interesting. And hopefully this information helps you think maybe a little bit differently about the problems that you're facing or the problem you're working on, the innovation that you're trying to develop, the problem you are trying to solve. So thanks again. Appreciate that time. Give us feedback. Let us know how you, whether or not you like these kinds of shows. We've been doing a whole string of what we refer to as solo shows, me just talking about different things to think about when you think about innovation or creativity or developing ideas or innovating in areas. But we bringing back more interviews to kind of mix it up, give a little variety. So we'd love to hear your feedback. You can drop me a note at phil@killerinnovations.com. That email comes directly to me. And also, again, help us pay it forward. This podcast started in 2005. We're coming up on season 18, March 1st, which is happening right around the corner here. That will be the launch of season 18. We are the longest continuously produced podcast in history, and we continually want to innovate the podcast, the content, the structure, the flow, the information, so that it's delivering value to you. So please give us feedback. Let us know how we're doing. what you think we should change, what we should do differently, and how we could actually bring more value to you to make and support your innovation efforts wherever they may take you. With that, thanks again for listening to this day's show. We really appreciate it, and we'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.